Hi, everybody. So it's another Monday, and I was kind of struggling this week deciding what we should talk about for book suggestions. And I was having a talk with somebody about how we were talking about sci-fi and fantasy and what the difference between those two is, because they get lumped together a lot as a genre, which I don't really think is necessarily accurate. I guess their separation from present day reality is what makes them get lumped together, but I would argue they're very different. And I tend to prefer fantasy over science fiction. So when people ask me what that means, my most basic explanation is that it means I prefer dragons and wizards and magic to spaceships and aliens, which isn't entirely fair, because sci-fi is not all spaceships and aliens. There's actually a whole world of kind of technology-based science fiction, thriller kind of books, which I will talk about another week because I just read one that I loved. But fantasy has always spoken to me very deeply. I don't know why. I mean, call it a kindred spirit thing with the last name Dragon, but I really like fantasy books. And I think what it is that I love is the world building, which sci-fi does also. But I like the idea of an author creating this whole alternate universe with different languages and genealogies and histories. And I mean, to me, I guess that's just a really impressive thing to be able to do, to have the imagination to create a whole alternate world to what we have. And I often think they're very tied to reality in that they are often reflective of the circumstances that the author is living through at the time. And I think they can teach us a lot of great lessons about being better people. So I wanted to talk about some of my favorite fantasy books, which are often trilogies, it turns out. But I'll again put all of the photos of the covers at the end. So if you are interested in checking any of these out, I will also say it does seem to be some sort of stigma about fantasy, as if it's only for teenagers or I don't know. I would highly encourage you, if you think you're not into any kind of book, try one, especially a great one that somebody recommends, because oftentimes you might be surprised, because I felt that way about the sci-fi book I just read. I was surprised that I liked it. I didn't anticipate liking it. So the first one I want to talk about today, because I just think father of fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the book that I would start with for a beginner would be The Hobbit. The reason being that The Lord of the Rings is his most famous trilogy. The Hobbit takes place in his timeline before The Lord of the Rings. And also it's one volume and it's a pretty short read. So I feel like it packs all of the adventure and the fun things about fantasy into a very short book, as opposed to The Lord of the Rings, which is a fantastic trilogy and I adored, but there's a lot more to it and it can get a little slow moving in parts. And there's a lot of delving into the genealogies and the different types of creatures and that live in his world and blah, blah, blah. So I would start out with The Hobbit. And if you like The Hobbit, then there's a good chance you're going to like The Lord of the Rings. But The Hobbit is just a fast-paced adventure story about a regular hobbit who I would argue is an everyman, and he is forced out of his little hobbit hole on an adventure, really on a quest to save, his race and his people, and all different types of races and people. It's really wonderful story. Gandalf the Wizard is in it. Bilbo Baggins is the main character, the Hobbit. There's a dragon called Smaug. And there is just this idea of everybody working together to create a better world. J.R.R. Tolkien wrote these books during the World Wars. And so there is this sense of kind of impending doom and darkness, which I would argue you could see some of in our mood today across the world with everything going on. And the stories are really heartening, ones of hope, ones of love, ones of working together to achieve a better place for all of us on this planet. And so I don't know, I think there's some really universal truths in that, and it's just really wonderfully written, and what an imagination. So if you haven't ever read Tolkien because you think you're not into that, try The Hobbit, because I think you might be surprised. It's excellent. I loved it. And so then I would say the next one I wanted to talk about is another fave of mine, Neil Gaiman, who everybody who knows me knows I talk about him all the time because he is my author crush and I obsess over all of his books. But my actual favorite Neil Gaiman book is one called Neverwhere. And I would describe it as a steampunky Alice in Wonderland kind of story, where the main character lives in London in present day and then falls down this quote unquote rabbit hole into an underside of London that is magical and full of weird creatures and different mythologies, and fascinating. Loved it so much. Didn't read it until a few years ago, and that's when I discovered Neil Gaiman. Actually, I read that book, and then that was it. I was hooked. His books are not all, where Tolkien's books are all similar, Gaiman's books are very different. So each book is weird in its own way. Neverwhere, though, is very, if you like the story of Alice in Wonderland and things kind of being topsy-turvy and upside down and that element of fantasy, that's all in the Neil Gaiman book Neverwhere, along with like some quirky characters and some really funny parts and some just, I loved it. I wish they would make it into a movie. I would watch it in a heartbeat. So check out that one. And again, if you've read a Neil Gaiman book and didn't love it, they're also different, that you might really like Neverwhere. So check that one out. Another more recent author who I enjoyed a lot, Erica Johansson. She wrote this trilogy called The Queen of the Tearling. And it is a traditional fantasy. Like there's a sort of medieval element to it, which does seem to tie together a lot of fantasy books, like the Game of Thrones books, the Lord of the Rings. It's not historically past, but there is that element of like kings and knights and armies and great clashes over the who's going to rule the world kind of stuff. They all seem to, a lot of them have that in common. So the Queen of the Tearling is similar to that, except for the lead character is a woman, which love, not just a man, but she is a woman, and she inherits something that gives her a certain amount of power, and she has to adjust to this role that's sort of thrust upon her, much like Bilbo, who was not anticipating it and ended up being responsible for something larger than himself. So there are 3 books. It's a trilogy. I loved them all, ripped right through them. I haven't read them in a while, but they were fantastic. I just remember being captured right into the story in a way that I really enjoy. And that's the thing about fantasy, is while it may have bigger themes that are applicable, it's also a bit escapist, which is my jam. I love some escapism. So Erica Johansson, Queen of the Tearling. And then there's 2 other trilogies I wanted to mention that are more modern. So the first one is by V.E. Schwab is the author's name. And the first book in the trilogy is called A Darker Shade of Magic. And there are 3 books. They're lengthier, and it is an alternate world. And it's very focused on magic, where some of these others aren't. This world is very focused on magic and magicians. Certain people are born into a bloodline that gives them these powers, and each kingdom has their own magician, but it's obviously not bunny out of a top hat kind of magic. It's much larger than that, and there are battles between the magicians to prove who's the best magician, and there's warring worlds and warring kingdoms, and really, really good. She wrote a few standalone books, including one called Vicious that was a young adult book that I loved, but I really got hooked on the Darker Shade of Magic trilogy. So if you're into the magic part, that one might be for you. And I would argue the same about the last one I wanted to talk about, which is the Invisible Library trilogy by Genevieve Cogman. So that one, clearly it's magic and libraries. And there's a dragon. So I'm into all of it. It is they're quicker reads, they're shorter books, and it proposes that there is a library that exists sort of outside of all of the other worlds, and that the librarians are the controllers of the power and the knowledge within it, which is sort of, in a good way. They're very positive beings in these books, just like they are in real life. They're out to help people, but also to protect this knowledge from being either harmed or erased by anybody, and the value that it adds to their world. So I loved these books, ran right through them. I don't know if I know a trilogy is a bit of a commitment, but always remember, you could just read the first book. You don't have to read the others. I highly recommend it, but you don't have to. So I am happy to recommend some other standalones if people aren't into trilogies. But if you ever want to talk fantasy, seek me out, because I have a ton of recommendations of all of my favorites. And depending on what you're looking for, the more medieval warring elements, the more magical elements, all of that, I can make some recommendations. And we will definitely talk about sci-fi in an upcoming talk, because it is a genre that I have been guilty of kind of brushing off, and have found some books that I really love, because again, there are many different types of sci-fi in that genre. So thank you all for listening to me talk yet again. And I love hearing from you. I've heard from quite a few people who have been watching these, and there is nothing I love more than doing one of these talks and then seeing books that I talked about get checked out for curbside. It's awesome. So know that I'm watching, know that I pay attention. I'm pulling those books and thinking, oh, I hope they watch the book talk. And if there are, again, suggestions, anything you want to tell me about or a book you want to discuss, let me know. And otherwise, we will be back soon with another talk. And I miss you all. And I hope that you're using our curbside services to get your latest reads. And also check out Hoopla and Overdrive if you can't get here physically. And we have a new newsletter coming out in print at the end of September that has a whole bunch of news for you and some events. Online events, but still things that you can participate in with the library and the librarians, because we all miss you terribly. It was so good to see you all, and I will see you next week.